Alice, good to see you. Welcome to GB News. Early weeks, great to have you with us. I must say, I was watching the footage you were sending earlier. It looked quite scary. There was a sense of violence. I mean, it looked as if it could have kicked off.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I genuinely thought somebody was going to get run over, someone was going to be hurt, whether that was one of the protesters or whether that was one of the lorry drivers. I mean, it was just got so aggressive between both sides when you saw people literally sort of pulling people with the back of their sleeves and just dragging them across the road. And then also drivers kind of going into the sort of central reserve. I mean, I just don't know how cars didn't get damaged. I mean, it was really, really quite almost, I would say, slightly frightening at times as a sort of bystander, sort of watching the whole sort of situation unfold. I mean, if someone hasn't been hurt this time, it's surprising. And if there's another time, I mean, it could happen again, because I think people are getting really sort of exasperated with the situation.
Yeah, it was extraordinary television. It really was. Well done to you. Tell us about some of the conversations that you had with people on both sides today.
Yeah, well, first of all, when we got there, we were there on the scene very early, and we were speaking to some of the protesters, but sort of before they sort of started to lie down and things. And I was speaking to one man who, interestingly enough, had only 2 years ago become interested in sort of the environment, and said he'd sort of suddenly sort of started to educate himself, and like many of the other protesters, felt he'd been lobbying the government, he'd been involved with his local council, and felt that people weren't listening to him, and was very frustrated and felt so sort of compelled, really, that this was their only option. And that was the message I kept hearing from the protesters: we have no choice, we have to be doing this. But when it came to sort of the motorists, it obviously was a much more kind of human story, and it was really heartbreaking, to be honest, hearing some of the people I spoke to. I mean, there was one woman who was sort of 12 weeks pregnant, and she was going to be going to hospital for her 12-week scan, which is obviously a very important scan.
Massive.
Yeah, and so she was already sort of, I imagine, quite nervous. And she, needed to get that hospital appointment, so she was quite nervous. In the end, actually, we sort of were able to sort of watch her go through, and I was really pleased for her. But there was also, lorry drivers who... There was one guy who I really felt sorry for, and he was on the way for a job interview. And we know with HGV drivers at the moment, there's a real shortage, there's a real issue there.
And he was going to...
I was going to an interview.
To be an HGV driver?
Yeah, just, a mile down the road. And I just thought, well, I hope your future boss is watching this.
Yeah.
So those were two that really sort of stood out to me. But, I mean, they were both sort of relatively calm. I mean, there was one woman who was just come back from a night shift, and I've done night shifts, and you wouldn't want to be blocking a road when I'm trying to go to bed at the end of it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that poor girl, you could just see she was white, she was desperate to get home, and she just couldn't understand what was happening. So it was quite a sad scene in some ways. It was aggressive and quite sad as well. Yeah,
for the first time, there's first footage I've seen, Alice, where you had both men and women getting out of their cars to drag these protesters off the road, and then, of course, the presenters scuttle back in front of their cars as they get back. I mean, it can't be long until there is an injury, as you say. I mean, obviously, no one wants that to happen, but the tempers are so high, and it strikes me there's a bit of a culture war going on here. These are, if you're on the road at 6:30 in the morning, right, you're generally a working class person. If you're not going to the city to trade stocks and shares or something, you're generally doing a pretty tough job because you need the money to support yourself and your family. And a lot of these protesters, they seem to be older, relatively wealthy, shall we say, middle-class people who have got their pensions and their houses without mortgages. You can see why there could be hatred between people trying to make ends meet, driving their vans and their cars early in the morning, and protesters who are so driven by the sense of their own argument that no one can possibly deny anything that they're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, we've seen quite a few protests over the last few weeks, but I think this was one that was particularly aimed at a certain demographic. We were just surrounded by industrial estates. I mean, it was most people were lorry drivers. By absolutely the vast majority were lorry drivers. Two were sort of fuel tankers, and I was thinking, well, there's a lot of petrol stations that really need some petrol right now. You know what I mean? And so I think that was really sort of struck me, was that it was a very particular type of demographic that were being targeted in this way. And I don't think that was an accident. I think they have been very clever in the way that they have their strategies. I mean, over over the last sort of 5 weeks or so, we've seen all the sort of the main motorways around London, the M25, the M4, around Dover. I mean, it's all very strategic to send a very clear message out to the government. Whether that message is getting through in the way they want, I'm not so convinced by, because that was something I kept sort of asking them. And one lorry driver said to me, he said, I understand why they're doing this, but why aren't they protesting out by Parliament? It was quite hard to sort of disagree with that. Why are you doing it here, affecting sort of working class people, as you say, and why are you not outside Parliament? And I think that was quite difficult to square.
But until quite recently, no one had heard of Insulate Britain. If their objective has been to get publicity, they've nailed it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there was a lot of, you know, some of their aims I think a lot of people in the country would support. But I suppose the question is, do you start alienating some of the people you need to be sort of getting on board with? And as I say, I feel like there's a sort of, the relationship with the government just sort of seems to be sort of getting worse and worse. I mean, we saw sort of Priti Patel at the Tory party conference sort of saying that, you know, she's going to be, you know, bringing new powers with a already quite controversial policing bill. There doesn't seem to be a dialogue in which they're sort of looking more seriously at what they're wanting and their demands. If anything, the more aggressive they get, the more that the government is saying, right, we need to clamp down on protesters. So I don't think there's a healthy communication between the two. And I think we'll just end up in a stand-up. That's what I foresee, because I can't see any dialogue at the moment.
Alice Porter, GB News London correspondent. Great to have you with us.